911 operators, what's the dumbest call you've ever had to handle? Story 1. Not a 911 operator, but this one still sticks with me. When my friend and I were around 9 or 10, we got bored and decided to go doorbell ditching. That got old fast, so we started leaving random objects on people's porches. Tennis balls, rocks, anything we could find. We thought it was hilarious to watch from a distance as people reacted. Eventually, we found some empty cardboard boxes in the trash, resealed them, and left them on porches just to see what people would do. But after a couple of those, we ran out of boxes. That's when we found an empty Parmesan cheese container. Since it was clear plastic, we figured it wouldn't be funny enough, so we wrapped it in black tape before leaving it on someone's porch. We rang the doorbell and waited. Someone poked their head out but didn't react much, so we figured it was a bust and went home. An hour later, my brother called me to his room and said, "Did you see what's happening outside?" I looked out his window and saw our entire street, plus 2 neighboring streets, lined with fire trucks, police cars, ambulances, and even the bomb squad. Turns out they thought the Parmesan container was an explosive. Their little bomb-diffusing robot picked it up and discovered it was empty. Never did that again. Story 2. Not me, but my mom worked as a dispatcher years ago, and she handled some truly bizarre calls. A few of the more memorable ones: a group of people tried to trap a full-grown bull moose in the corner of a preschool playground. A guy was roller skating down a major highway while flying a kite. And then there was the legendary UFO sighting. It was winter, and people driving down the highway kept calling in about a strange glowing object in a snowy field. Turns out the property owner had built a circular fence, wrapped it in lights, and then let the snow drift over it, creating a perfect UFO shape. It was all an elaborate prank, and it fooled a lot of people. Story 3. I build and fly radio-controlled RC model airplanes, and one day at our flying field, we had quite the unexpected emergency response. Our club's flying field is about half a mile from a highway. It was a perfect summer day, and we were having fun making our planes do loops, rolls, and spins. Some of them even had smoke generators, making for a cool visual. Suddenly, a police car pulled up. Apparently, a driver on the highway had called in, reporting an airplane going down, trailing smoke. Then a fire truck showed up, then a newspaper reporter, and then the life flight helicopter landed on our runway. It took almost an hour to convince everyone that no, a real plane hadn't crashed. It was just our model planes doing stunts with smoke. Story 4. Had a woman call today because her mother wouldn't buy her chicken nuggets. Before that, a man called to report a dead crow in his yard. I asked, "Okay, and?" He got upset and explained that other crows were starting to eat it. I really wanted to tell him to just wait 30 minutes and his problem would solve itself. Story 5. I work as a paramedic firefighter at a large metropolitan airport. We get a lot of nonsense calls, but 2 stand out. A guy got hit in the head with an empty plastic water bottle that fell from an overhead bin. A flight attendant reported coming into contact with an unknown white powder on a plane. Full-blown emergency response, 7 fire trucks, ambulances, even aid units from surrounding areas, plane quarantined, everyone panicking. The unknown white powder? Old tissues that had disintegrated. Story 6. I wasn't a dispatcher, but I used to be a firefighter and medic. One of the most ridiculous calls I ever got dispatched to was a man complaining of chest pains and difficulty breathing. Since that's a high-priority emergency, we rushed over with lights and sirens. When we arrived, the guy was perfectly fine. No chest pain, no breathing issues. Instead, he had a packed suitcase and was ready to go to the ER for, drumroll please, a hangnail on his left big toe. His reasoning? If he called in with chest pain and trouble breathing, he'd be seen right away at the ER instead of waiting. At that time, we weren't allowed to refuse transport, even if we knew the system was being abused. So we took him in, handed over the report, and got a knowing look from the admitting nurse. She caught on immediately. When I saw her again later, she told me they made him wait around 13 hours before a doctor saw him. Story 7. One night, as I was wrapping up my last shift of the work week, I got a call about a rescue situation. It was nearly midnight, and the guy on the phone sounded panicked. He explained, in way too much detail, that he had inserted a toothbrush into his rectum for self-pleasure and now couldn't get it out. I transferred the call to the rescue dispatcher, who continued questioning him. The caller insisted he could feel the toothbrush deep inside, claiming it had reached his intestines. A pretty disgusting way to end the night, but the real shock came when we realized he was only 13 years old. Some responders were horrified, others couldn't stop laughing. Calls like that were rare, but they definitely stuck with you. Story 8. I'm not a 911 operator, but I have plenty of friends and family in EMS. The most frustrating calls, without a doubt, come from people abusing the system, especially those using Medicaid for ridiculous reasons. One woman called an ambulance just to have her toenails clipped because she weighed 500 pounds and couldn't reach them herself. Others call because they work a few blocks from the hospital and find it easier, faster, and cheaper to take an ambulance rather than figure out transportation. But my all-time favorite? A woman once called 911 claiming she was coughing up pieces of her heart. Look, I get that not everyone has medical knowledge, but come on, that's not even remotely possible. For that to happen, her heart would have to dissolve, she'd need to inhale the pieces, somehow generate enough force to cough them up, and then those heart fragments would have to be small enough to pass through her throat. It would take some kind of medical miracle for that to be real. Story 9, I wasn't a dispatcher, but I once had to ride all the way to the far edge of the district on an open jump seat in the middle of January for what was reported as fire shooting out of every window. When we got there, the fire turned out to be a disco ball reflecting lights onto a house. Then there was the guy who set up a ladder to climb onto his roof to adjust an antenna strapped to his chimney. Climbing up an icy roof is one thing, but getting back down, much harder. He ended up stuck on the peak, clinging to the chimney for over an hour until his wife realized he was missing and came outside to check on him. He got a free ride down, courtesy of the aerial ladder. Story 10. When I was living in London, I had a favorite spot where I ate lunch every day, a beautiful park built among the ruins of a church bombed in World War II. One afternoon, as I turned the corner, I saw a woman hunched in a corner, looking like she was crying. As I walked further, I saw a man standing over her, holding a baseball bat above his head, completely still. I can't describe the sheer terror I felt. I immediately called the police while pacing back and forth at the entrance, trying to get as much detail as possible about their clothing. The man never swung the bat. He just stood there, completely motionless. It was so bizarre. There were also two other men standing nearby, but I was too focused on the main scene to pay much attention to them. Minutes later, two police cars pulled up silently. The officers went in quickly but walked back out just as casually a few minutes later. No arrest, no commotion, just a quiet departure. Confused, I passed by again and finally noticed the two other men more clearly. That's when I saw them adjusting cameras on tripods. Turns out I had just called the police on a very weird photo shoot. No idea what the operator thought of my panicked call, but I can only imagine she was rolling her eyes. Story 11. I'm not a 911 operator, but I did have to call 911 for myself once, and it was one of the weirdest experiences of my life. A little backstory. I had just come home from university. My boyfriend had been away visiting family for the past day, so I was alone. As soon as I got home, I went straight to the bathroom, lifted the toilet seat, and used it. After flushing, I suddenly realized there had been poop in the toilet before I even went. At first, I thought maybe my boyfriend had forgotten to flush, but then it hit me. He hadn't been home. There was no way it could have been him. Panic set in. I checked every room, opened all the cupboards, even looked under the bed. No one was there. I called my best friend, and she immediately told me to call 911, so I did. Operator, 911, what's your emergency? Me. Hi, I think someone broke into my apartment. Operator, why do you think that? Was the door open when you got home? Me. No, it was locked, but, there was poop in my toilet. Operator, clearly trying not to laugh. I'm sorry, what? Me. Explains the situation. I know for a fact that I didn't use the bathroom today. Operator, okay, we'll send an officer to check things out. Me. Thank you. Turns out, the person who had lived in the apartment before us still had a key. He had been sneaking in when we weren't home, to watch TV, relax, and apparently use the bathroom. If he had just flushed properly, we probably never would have found out. Needless to say, we changed the locks immediately. Story 12. A good friend of mine worked as a 911 dispatcher and shared some of the strangest calls he ever took. Here are two of the best ones. A man working at a fast food restaurant called to file a police report. Someone had allegedly broken into his locker at work and stolen some of his personal belongings. That alone isn't too unusual, but his reason for filing the report was he claimed the stolen items contained his DNA. According to him, this was a big deal because he was related to President Kennedy and a rare breed. He genuinely believed someone had stolen his DNA for nefarious purposes. A nervous-sounding 23-year-old man called for an ambulance but refused to explain why. The dispatcher pressed him for details, saying the EMTs needed to know what they were walking into. After a long pause, the caller finally admitted that he had been using a toy and had lost it inside himself. My friend calmly took down the necessary information and then paged the ambulance for a 23-year-old male with penetrating trauma. Story 13. A few years ago, I worked at a nursing home that had its fair share of difficult residents and even crazier family members. One woman, the sister of a resident, was particularly unhinged. She insisted that we call her after every single meal so she could speak with her brother. One day we were running a little behind schedule, which happens in nursing homes all the time. We hadn't gotten the resident back to his bed yet, meaning we hadn't made the call. Instead of waiting, his sister started calling the nurse's station repeatedly. The LPN on duty was busy and away from the desk, so no one answered. Her response? She called 911 and reported that the entire nursing home had burned to the ground. I was sitting at the front desk on the first floor when suddenly a swarm of police officers and firefighters came rushing into the building. A cop approached me and, completely serious, asked, "I thought this place was on fire?" I have no idea what happened to that woman afterward, but I really hope she got fined or at least chewed out by the LPN. Sadly, whatever the consequences were, they didn't stop her from being a complete nightmare. Story 14. I'm an EMT, and there's a woman in my area who calls 911 all the time for the most ridiculous reason. She sits on her couch, drops her bowl on the floor, and calls dispatch claiming she's sick. When we arrive, she admits she just needs us to pick up the bowl for her. She's fully capable of walking and bending down, but she refuses to do it herself. One day, after multiple calls, we finally told her to stop wasting emergency services on this nonsense. 5 minutes after we left, she called again. She had dropped her bowl again. Story 15. I was the idiot who called 911. It was my first year of university, and I was already struggling with severe anxiety. One day, I went to the laundry room in my building to grab my clothes, only to find that someone had stolen all of my towels and socks from the washing machine. But here's the weird part. They closed the machine and started it again, completely empty. Someone had actually taken my wet socks and towels. Panic set in. My brain wasn't exactly processing things rationally, so I called my residence advisor. They told me to contact campus security. Campus security, unsurprisingly, said there wasn't much they could do. Desperate, I asked if there was anything else I could try. The security officer, probably joking, replied, "You could call the police." So, of course, I did. One non-emergency call later, I somehow had an official case file for my missing towels and socks. My family still won't let me live that one down. Story 16. A woman once called 911 to report that she had run over herself with her own car. She wasn't injured, didn't want medical attention. She just called in case someone else had seen it happen and reported it. She wanted to clarify that she was fine. Another ridiculous one. A woman got eyelash extensions, wasn't happy with the results, and decided the logical thing to do was call 911. And then there are the parents. So many parents call just to have an officer threaten their kids with jail time for not eating dinner, staying out late, refusing to go to bed, stealing candy, or skipping homework. It happens way more than you'd think. Story 17. I wasn't a dispatcher, but I was the one who made the call. At the time, I was fresh out of college, unemployed, and binge-watching NCIS and Criminal Minds while remodeling my bedroom. One morning, around 8 a.m., the doorbell woke me up. I was only wearing underwear and an oversized t-shirt, and since I would have to pass by the front door to check who it was, I decided to stay in bed. I messed around on my phone for a while, but just as I was about to get up, the doorbell rang again. This time I heard the screen door open, followed by knocking, a pause, and then the doorknob jiggling. After a few moments, the screen door closed again. Curious but cautious, I peeked outside from my parents' room and saw a black car with dealer plates parked in front of our house. I shrugged it off and went about my day. A couple of hours later, I was in the garage throwing things away when I saw the same car pull up again. It idled for a minute, so I walked to the front door to check, but there was no one there. Since I was close enough to the garage door, whoever was inside the car might have seen me. Now, having just binged an unhealthy amount of crime dramas, my brain immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. Someone was casing the house for a robbery. While my neighborhood was relatively safe, there had been a few weird incidents in the past, so I decided to call the non-emergency line. I told the dispatcher that I might have just scared off a potential burglar, and they sent an officer over. When the officer arrived, he pointed to a car parked in my neighbor's driveway and asked if that was the one I had seen. I stepped out, looked around the bushes by the porch, and sure enough, it was the same car. I admitted I'd never seen it before that day, and said, "I'm probably just being a paranoid idiot." The cop said he'd check it out and would be back in a minute. 15 minutes passed. I started freaking out, thinking something had gone horribly wrong. Maybe the officer had been taken hostage, but there were no gunshots, so probably not. In the middle of recording a Snapchat video to my best friend, the officer finally returned, laughing. Turns out, he had approached the house and noticed the front door was slightly open. Thinking, oh crap, she might actually be right, he drew his weapon and announced himself. That's when my neighbor, Jay, walked out. Apparently, Jay had just bought a new car, and the mysterious visitor was someone from the dealership dropping off paperwork for him to sign. I sighed. So, I am just a paranoid idiot. The officer grinned and said, "Well, not an idiot. I'd rather you be paranoid and wrong than oblivious and dead." To this day, I don't think Jay knows I was the one who called the cops on his paperwork delivery. But honestly, come on, Jay. Stop leaving your front door open. It looks suspicious, especially in the middle of winter. Story 18. I work as a professional paramedic firefighter in a suburban area, and I have never seen anyone arrested or cited for abusing the 911 system. I've heard about it happening, but in reality, not once. People abuse 911 every single day, and the crazy part is that we reward them for it. Call an ambulance for a minor complaint, we'll take you wherever you want to go. Don't want to pay the bill? Just ignore it. Chances are, nothing will happen. And if we don't take you, if we do try to say no, well, if you decide to sue, you'll probably win. Honestly, I know some people find these stories funny, but after years of dealing with it, I just feel frustrated. It's exhausting knowing that people can and do waste emergency resources with zero consequences. Story 19. I'm not a 911 operator, but I once had to deal with a 911 call in a very unexpected way. I work at a hotel, and whenever a guest calls 911, our switchboard at the front desk explodes with alarms and beeping. It's great for real emergencies, but more often than not, it's just a kid messing around, excited to be away from home. One summer day in 2017, the lobby was packed, and I was the only one working. Suddenly, the switchboard went off. My training had been rushed, so I had no idea how to turn off the alarm. I discreetly excused myself, saying I had to attend to a guest emergency, and sprinted to the room that had placed the call. Inside, I found a family in absolute distress over their dog. Specifically, their dog had eaten a small piece of a chocolate chip muffin. The dog, meanwhile, looked completely fine, just a little confused by the drama. I told them this was not an emergency for 911 and that they should call a vet instead. I went back to the front desk, confirmed with dispatch that there was no actual emergency, and tried to get back to work. 15 minutes later, the same family stormed into the lobby, crying and making a scene, insisting they had to use the switchboard to call a vet. The dog still looked perfectly healthy. At that moment, I was checking in a guest, the phones were ringing, and I just didn't have time to deal with them. I told them, unfortunately, the switchboard was not for guest use and suggested they call from their room. Their response? We don't know how. To speed things up, I used my own phone to call a vet for them. The woman sobbed dramatically while talking to the vet. Then the whole family piled into a cab and left. An hour later, they returned, with the dog still in pristine condition. Story 20. My dad was a police officer, and one day he responded to a call about a wild animal on someone's car. When he arrived, he saw nothing. The woman who had called pointed at the hood and insisted the animal was still there. Upon closer inspection, my dad finally spotted the threat. A single leaf. Yes. She called 911 over a leaf on her car. Story 21. My dad was a firefighter, and one winter he got a call about a house fire. When the crew arrived, the house was completely intact. No smoke, no flames, nothing. Turns out a neighbor across the street had seen a flickering orange glow in the window and assumed the house was on fire. In reality, she had been looking at the reflection of her own fireplace in the glass. Story 22. One morning, when it was still dark out, I saw a minivan driving on the wrong side of the road. Every now and then, it would drift into the gravel on the shoulder. Thinking it might be a drunk driver, I called 911. The dispatcher seemed unimpressed. Turns out, it was just the newspaper delivery guy. I had never seen a mail carrier who wasn't in a postal truck, so I had no idea what I was looking at. I don't regret calling, though. If it had been a drunk driver and they hit someone, I would have felt responsible for not reporting it. Story 23. I'm not a dispatcher, but when I was a kid, I accidentally called 911 over a fart. My brother and I were in the basement playing Mario Party. I beat him in a minigame and he started laughing so hard that he farted on me. Disgusted, I shouted, "That's so gross! I'm calling the police!" There was a phone in the basement, so I picked it up and dialed, thinking it wouldn't actually go through. It did. The police showed up at 2 a.m. to lecture us. Mom was furious. Dad, on the other hand, thought it was hilarious. Story 24. I don't work in 911, but I do work at a 24/7 fusion center. We get so many ridiculous calls. One time, someone from Michigan called us in Florida asking for the number to Michigan State Police. How did they manage to find our number, but not theirs? After hurricanes, we also get calls from people asking us how traffic will be when they return home days later. Sorry, let me just grab my crystal ball. And then, there's one guy who calls us constantly, convinced that some guy named Puffy Combs stole my identity, and that Tupac rapes grandmas on cruises. Story 25. I live in a small town where my husband is a police officer. I love his dispatchers, and sometimes hang out in the call center. There's one caller they get all the time, an old man who calls only when he's drunk and lonely. He just wants someone to talk to. It's honestly kind of sad. Sometimes they send an ambulance to take him to the hospital for detox, but most of the time, they just chat with him until he falls asleep. Story 26. We once responded to a call for poisoning. When we arrived, we found an elderly woman who lived alone, anxiously clutching a half-full jug of milk. She wasn't sure if it had gone bad, so there we were, a full ambulance crew and a team of firefighters standing in her kitchen, passing around a jug of milk, taking turns smelling it. Definitely not the best use of emergency resources, but honestly, it was kind of adorable. Story 27. 911 dispatcher here, working call taking tonight. Huge respect to all the call takers out there. This job is tough. Before I became a dispatcher, I once got a call from a drunk guy who claimed he had just witnessed a domestic dispute outside a liquor store. I tried to get details, but he was so wasted he couldn't even tell me where he was. For 5 straight minutes, he yelled at me for not doing my job while I was just trying to figure out his location so I could actually send officers. Then there was the woman who called to ask for a welfare check on a friend. She refused to give me her name, wouldn't give me his real name, just Jimmy, and had no idea where he was. But she did have some GPS coordinates, somehow. Story 28. Not a 911 operator, but my friend is a firefighter. One time he got a call for a woman who had pulled over on the side of the road with a horrific headache. Because they assumed the worst, stroke, brain aneurysm, etc., they rushed over with lights and sirens. When they got there, the woman refused any medication or transport and just continued driving home with a passenger who could have driven instead. Her reason for calling 911? Well, someone should know I had a headache. Story 29. I'm not a 911 operator, but I work as a security guard. One time, my colleague didn't follow proper procedures, and a patron ended up calling the cops on her. The issue? In our job, if a patron requests to see our security license, we're legally required to show it. She refused. Definitely a ridiculous reason to call the police, but at least the patron had the sense to call the non-emergency line. The next day, our supervisor pulled her aside and showed her the specific law requiring us to show our IDs when asked. Instead of just acknowledging the mistake, she threw a tantrum, then called 911 because she felt victimized by our supervisor. Oh, and by the way, she actually wants to be a cop. Story 30. Not an operator, but I was an unintentional 911 caller. Back in 2001, I got a new cell number that ended in 911. My service provider at the time was a small regional carrier with, let's just say, less than perfect technology. Whenever I left my local service area, if I tried to check my voicemail by dialing my own number, as was common back then, I wouldn't get my messages. I'd get patched directly through to emergency dispatch for whatever area I was in. I had more than a few awkward conversations that started with, "Oh crap, sorry, I was just trying to check my messages." Thankfully, the dispatchers were always surprisingly understanding about it. The issue eventually disappeared after about a year and a half. Story 31. When I was in preschool, I snuck into the administrator's office, dialed 911, and called them a butthead. To this day, I hope I'm the stupidest call that operator ever received. The school got a very firm lecture from the police about only calling in actual emergencies. I never admitted it, but everyone knew it was me. They all knew. Story 32. My ex-boyfriend worked as a 911 operator, and he had plenty of ridiculous calls. Some were innocent, people losing pet birds, a lonely old lady who just wanted to talk, and even someone calling just to ask what time it was. Then there were the truly baffling ones, like the people who called because they saw a black man and a white woman together and decided that was somehow illegal. My ex would calmly tell them there was absolutely nothing wrong with that and wish them a good night. Nothing shuts down nonsense like killing it with kindness. Story 33. A guy once called 911 for an ambulance. He had a real medical issue and wanted to go to a specific hospital. Sounds normal, right? Except he was already in a hospital, lying in a hospital bed. He wanted to be transferred to a different one. Apparently this happens a lot. Some people believe they'll get better or faster treatment at another hospital if they arrive by ambulance. There have even been cases where people call 911 from inside the ER because they don't like the paramedics, don't like the hospital, or just want a second opinion. Some even ask to be taken to hospitals 50 miles away. Story 34. I once got guilt-tripped into running a half marathon for juvenile diabetes. I didn't train properly, but I had already paid the entry fee, so I figured I might as well go through with it. The night before, I went to bed early, like 8 p.m. early. Unfortunately, my neighbors were throwing a party. No big deal. It was a Friday night. What was a big deal? My girlfriend called 911 4 times trying to get the party shut down so I could sleep. I found out the next morning. I was horrified. I didn't train, and more importantly, that's not what 911 is for. I spent the entire race thinking about those poor kids, not the ones with diabetes, the ones whose party got shut down before quiet hours even started. I still give her crap for that. Story 35. Man, there are so many goofy 911 calls out there. Kids playing on the phone happens a lot. Some of the funniest ones come from very young kids calling in just to yell things. One of my favorites was a woman screaming about a raccoon in her attic. And of course, you have the constant calls from people who've locked themselves out of their own homes. At the end of the day, though, I always remind myself, what might seem ridiculous to me is still someone's perceived emergency. It's all about handling it with patience, redirecting them to the right resources, and moving on. That being said, yeah, some of these calls are hilarious. Story 36, I'm not a 911 operator or anything important in society, but my dad, a paramedic, has always told a great story about one of his most ridiculous calls. One night around 2 a.m., an elderly woman called 911, giving no details, just that she needed help. They rushed over, got inside, and found a large elderly woman sitting in bed, visibly distressed. The emergency? Her socks had fallen down, and she needed someone to pull them back up. Story 37. One of the weirdest calls I ever had to check on involved a woman who had a history of calling 911 for non-emergencies. Dispatch told me the caller spoke poor English, was possibly intoxicated, and was panicking about something. I rushed over, expecting the worst. When I arrived, she was completely sober. The emergency? Her toilet was clogged and overflowing. I did not fix it. Turns out our dispatcher was brand new and had just started that week. Story 38. I work at a restaurant, and one time, a 911 operator called us, not for an emergency, but to place an order. Apparently, an elderly woman had called 911, saying she was about to faint if she didn't get a sandwich and coffee delivered to her ASAP. Instead of ignoring her, the dispatcher actually paid for her order over the phone and had us deliver it to her. Some people in this world are truly kind. Story 39. I work for Australia's version of 911 now, and there are too many ridiculous calls to count. Some of the more memorable ones. People calling because there's a spider in their car. Okay, fair. This is Australia. Parents calling because their 8-year-old refuses to go to school. People reporting lost items, not stolen, just left in a taxi. Story 40. I was on a Coast Guard boat doing night training about 2 miles from the beach. We were running man-overboard drills, using a dummy with a strobe light attached so we could see it. At some point, our station received a call from someone on the beach, reporting a distress signal in the water. They contacted us asking if we could see anything, since the reported signal was supposedly right near our location. Nope, nothing. Then it hit us. The person on the beach had reported our training strobe, so we spent the next 2 hours searching for ourselves. Story 41. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, I called 911 because my mom was taking too long to make spaghetti. About 2 hours later, 2 uniformed police officers showed up at the door. I was terrified. They gave me a firm but kind talk about why prank calling 911 was dangerous because someone else could be in real danger. Then they gave me some stickers and told my mom and me to have a good night. Story 42. My dad was a 911 operator for years, and he had his fair share of bizarre calls. One of my favorites. Dad, 911, what's your emergency? Drunk caller. Yeah, I think I just heard a red car crash. Dad, you heard a red car crash? Drunk caller. Yeah, Dad. Okay, police are on their way. Click. Turns out the guy had been driving drunk, crashed his own car near his house, walked home, then called 911 to report what he heard. His brilliant plan was to make it seem like he was just a concerned citizen. But for some reason, he had to specify the car's color, because apparently a red car crashing sounds different than a blue one. Story 43. One of the weirdest calls I ever handled involved a man with burns all over his arms and face. While getting EMS en route, I started asking questions about how it happened, just in case there was an ongoing hazard. Eventually, the story unraveled. He had been trying to blow up groundhogs using black powder. The problem? Black powder doesn't explode unless it's tightly contained, otherwise it just burns hot and fast. So this genius had filled a groundhog hole with black powder, knelt over it, and dropped in a lit match. Story 44. Not a dispatcher, but my company once changed their phone system so that employees had to dial 9, then 1, then the area code, even for internal calls. As you can probably guess, tons of employees accidentally called 911. I think we actually got fined before they finally fixed it. Story 45. My dad, a police officer, once got a call from a woman who was terrified because a wild animal was on her property, and she feared for her and her child's safety. Since we lived in a rural town, dangerous animals like bears or coyotes weren't unheard of, so my dad rushed over. When he got there, the woman refused to leave her house, insisting the animal was right under her porch. Dad peered over the railing, ready for anything. It was a rabbit. We can only assume this woman had never stepped foot outside a big city because she was convinced that Bugs Bunny was some kind of vicious predator. Story 46. Last week, my iPhone started acting weird. The screen had gone black after I replaced it at the Apple Store, and when I tried to force restart it, it called 911. I had no idea it happened until they called back. I explained everything, and they let it slide. Then I tried again. It called 911 again. This time, 2 officers showed up. One of them, clearly thinking I was just bad with technology, smirked and asked in a condescending tone, "You want me to fix your iPhone for you?" I shrugged. "Sure, go ahead." He took my phone and confidently tried to force restart it. I tried to warn him. It was too late. 911 was dialed again from his hands. He then had to spend the next 10 minutes verifying his identity to dispatch and explaining why he had just called 911. His partner absolutely lost it laughing. Story 47, we got called out to a fancy social club at 2 a.m. for a report of a foot impaled by glass. Expecting the worst, we arrived and were led to a booth where a couple was still casually sipping their drinks. When we asked if they had called 911, the woman turned and said, "One of the waiters dropped a glass near my foot, and I just wanted a medical professional to check if there was any microscopic glass in it." We asked if she had any pain, numbness, cuts, or bleeding. She had none, and we did not transport her to the hospital. Story 48. A guy once called me in the middle of the night to ask if there was anywhere in town where he could get gas after midnight. This was 2006, not the dark ages. Credit cards existed. He got a lecture on what an actual emergency is. Story 49. My boss used to be 911. The most common emergency calls, elderly people complaining that the TV was showing age-restricted content before 10 p.m. Story 50. I was a 911 operator, and our center also handled fish and wildlife calls. 2 that stuck with me. A woman called crying because geese were swimming in the canal behind her house. She was terrified for them because boats passed through there. I asked, "Well, do they move out of the way?" She said yes, but she was still inconsolable. A man called furious because he had spent $1 million on his house and seagulls kept pooping on his car. I told him, "You spent $1 million on a house and didn't get a carport? Sounds like you should be calling your realtor." Story 51. A woman once called 911 to report a theft in her office. The stolen item? A slice of wedding cake she had left in the staff lunchroom overnight. Story 52. One of my all-time favorite calls came from one of our local regulars. She called 911, panicked, saying she needed an ambulance because her hand was stuck in her crotch. She kept insisting, "I didn't put it there, someone else did." When I asked for her location, she gave me an intersection instead of an address. She said she was standing on the corner. In my head, I thought, there's no way this woman is standing in broad daylight, sweatpants around her ankles, elbow deep in her own lady bits. The medics later called me back. She was, and she had an audience of about 8 people watching. Story 53. One day, I got a call from a guy at the dollar store. He had grabbed an item that was still wrapped in cellophane. It hadn't even been put on the shelves yet, and assumed that everything in the package was just $1. When the manager explained that no, those were individual items and had to be sold separately, the guy got furious and called 911. The officer told him he wouldn't be responding and that if he didn't like it, he should take his business elsewhere. The man was livid, insisting this was a federal offense. Honestly, most of the calls I get are pretty stupid, but we don't have a non-emergency line, so everything comes through us. It keeps things entertaining. My least favorite calls, the ones asking, "When will my power be back on?" I don't know. Call your electric company. Story 54. Had a guy who staked out his local community mailbox and called 911 to report a suspicious person putting things inside it around the same time every day. My response? Could it be the mailman? That ended the call pretty quickly. Story 55. I'm a tow truck driver, and one night around 3 a.m., I got a call for a wreck in a very dark rural area. The dispatcher told me to hurry since police were on the scene. When I arrived, I turned on my bright work lights and red and blue strobes. As I walked up, all I could see was a trash bin, a knocked-over mailbox, and a car that looked like it had been crushed by something heavy. I asked the driver what she hit. She looked at me and said, "The big black horse in the ditch." I walked around to look, and sure enough, there was a huge horse lying there. The driver was incredibly lucky to walk away with just a small scratch, considering her car was completely totaled. Story 56. A woman called 911 to report water leaking from a house while she was out walking her dog. She was convinced it was flooded inside. The police weren't busy, so we sent them to check it out. It was raining. She had literally just reported rainwater coming out of the gutters. Story 57. One of my favorite calls ever. An elderly woman had fallen and cut her leg. As part of the standard medical questions, I asked, Is your breathing normal? Her response, of course my bleeding isn't normal, you idiot. I don't just bleed out of my leg every day. No, ma'am, you're breathing. Oh, yes, that's normal, dear.